The cake was still warm in my hands when I heard him say it. "Careful, don't let the caterer trip over his own feet." Laughter cracked across the room like a whip, and my wife's laughter was somewhere inside it. I stood there, in my one good tie, flour still ground into the creases of my knuckles, and felt every year of my life fold down into something small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. I turned toward the door. One foot was already moving, and then my daughter's hand closed around my arm, and she whispered 4 words that stopped me cold. "Dad, just wait." My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 59 years old, and until about 11 minutes before that cake nearly ended up on the floor of the Cypress Grove Country Club ballroom, I believed I understood my marriage. I believed I understood my wife. I believed, foolishly, that 34 years of building something together meant something couldn't be quietly dismantled behind my back while I was busy building it. I'd gotten up that morning at 4:45, same as I do most mornings, except this time it wasn't for the shop. It was for Marlene's cake. 3 layers, lemon and lavender, the recipe she used to make for her own mother before her mother passed. I hadn't touched a mixing bowl in years. That had always been her domain. Flour on the counter, radio playing something from the 70s while she hummed along. But this year felt different. This year felt like something I needed to do with my own 2 hands, the way I do everything that matters to me. I burned my wrist twice pulling pans from the oven. I didn't care. I wanted her to walk into that room and see, sitting right there at the center of the table, proof that after 3 decades, I still paid attention. I still remembered what she loved before anyone else came along and told her what she should want instead. I run Briggs Fabrication out of a machine shop on the edge of town. 41 employees, contracts that stretch from here to 3 states over. It isn't a name that turns heads at a country club dinner. It isn't supposed to. I've never needed anyone's head to turn. I built that business out of a 2-bay garage with a second-hand lathe and a loan I paid off early out of pure stubbornness. And every single thing I own, I earned with grease under my fingernails and hours nobody saw. That has always been enough for me. I thought it was enough for Marlene, too. But lately, and I'll admit I'd been telling myself it was nothing, telling myself I was being an old man clinging too hard to the past. Lately, she'd started saying things a little differently at these events, introducing me a little differently. "Oh, Walter tinkers with machines," she said to a woman at a dinner party in March, and laughed like it was an inside joke I wasn't quite in on. I let it go. You let a lot of things go after 34 years, because you assume the foundation under you is solid, even when the floorboards start to creak. The man who made that crack about the caterer was named Trent Calloway. 6 foot something, a watch that cost more than my first truck, a laugh that came a half-second too fast, like he'd rehearsed being charming so many times, it didn't need thinking about anymore. Marlene called him her business partner. I'd heard that phrase enough times over the past year that it had started to sound less like an explanation and more like something being carefully arranged in front of me, piece by piece, so I wouldn't notice the picture it was actually forming. I stood there, holding that cake in the middle of my own wife's 60th birthday party, feeling 59 years old and about 12 at the same time. And I made peace right there with just leaving. Sliding the cake onto the nearest table and walking out into the parking lot and not looking back. Dignity, my father used to say, is knowing when a room isn't worth staying in. That's exactly when Paige grabbed my arm. Paige is 29, sharp as a tack, and has never once in her life said something just to make a moment easier. She gets that from me. So when she held onto my arm and told me to wait, I didn't argue, even with my pride still bleeding out all over that ballroom floor. I looked at her face and saw something I hadn't seen since she was a little girl about to tell me she'd broken something and needed help fixing it before her mother found out. Steady, focused, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room.
"Just breathe, Dad,"
She said, low enough that only I could hear it.
"You're about to become the most interesting man at this party. I promise you that."
I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. But I trusted her enough to set the cake down instead of the tie, and enough to stay standing right where I was instead of walking out those double doors into the Texas evening. I want to explain to you why that trust mattered so much, because you need to understand who I am before I tell you what happened next. I grew up 40 minutes outside Waco, the son of a diesel mechanic who believed a man's word was worth more than his bank account, and taught me the same. I started sweeping floors in his shop at 11 years old, and never really stopped working since. I met Marlene when I was 23, at a diner where she waited tables through nursing school. She had this laugh that filled up a whole room without trying, and eyes that looked at me. A grease-stained kid with calluses and no college degree, like I was worth looking at twice. We got married 18 months later in her parents' backyard with folding chairs and store-bought punch, and I promised her that night I'd build her something real. It took me 20 years longer than I wanted, but I did it. Briggs Fabrication started in 1998 with one lathe and a dream that everyone but Marlene told me was foolish. She believed in me when believing cost her something. Cost us both some lean years, some Christmases that were thinner than I wanted them to be. We raised Paige and her older brother Cole in a house I built additions onto myself, room by room, as the money allowed. Cole's a firefighter in Dallas now, married with 2 kids of his own. Paige works in forensic accounting, which, though I didn't know it that night, was about to become the single most important detail in this entire story. Marlene retired from nursing 8 years ago, after 31 years at the same hospital, and something shifted in her after that. I don't say that to blame her for what came next, because plenty of people retire and find new purpose in healthy, honest ways. But somewhere in that first year of empty afternoons, she started attending investment seminars downtown, the kind with a free lunch and a slideshow promising returns that should have made anyone raise an eyebrow. That's where Trent Calloway found her. Or maybe found us, is the more honest way to say it. Because I've come to understand now that people like Trent don't stumble into a room. They study it first. He called himself a wealth management consultant. He had a firm with a name that sounded impressive and told you nothing. Calloway Meridian Partners, letterhead thick as cardstock, an office in a building downtown that I'd later learn he leased month to month. He was smooth in that particular way certain men are smooth. The kind of smooth that makes you feel foolish for even noticing it. Like doubting him says more about your character than his. Over the past year, Marlene had gone from mentioning him occasionally to mentioning almost nothing else. Golf with Trent, coffee with Trent, to discuss portfolio diversification. A joint account, she explained one evening, almost too casually, that would let her manage some of her retirement funds more actively without bothering me with the details. I remember nodding along like a man agreeing to something he doesn't yet understand is a mistake. I trusted her. 34 years, I trusted her completely. I had absolutely no idea how far that trust had already been spent without my knowledge. Looking back now, I can see the whole thing the way you see a photograph developing in a darkroom. Faint at first, then suddenly, all at once, impossible to unsee. But at the time, it came to me in pieces so small I kept explaining each one away before it had the chance to sit next to the others and form a pattern. It started with small things. Marlene began dressing differently for her meetings with Trent, a little more care than she used to put into a Tuesday afternoon. She started using phrases that didn't sound like her, phrases with a polish to them like asset allocation and diversified exposure, words she'd clearly picked up from him and repeated back like a student eager to impress her teacher. I told myself it was good for her.
Retirement can hollow a person out if they let it.
And here she was, engaged, energized, talking about something with real enthusiasm for the first time in years. I wanted to be happy for her. Some nights I managed it, but then came the introductions. We were at a Chamber of Commerce mixer in the spring, the kind of event I usually avoid, but Marlene had asked me to come. And a woman I didn't recognize asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Marlene laughed and said, "Oh, Walter tinkers with machines out at his little shop." Little shop. 41 employees and contracts with 3 Fortune 500 suppliers. And to her, in that moment, in front of a stranger, it had become a little shop. I laughed along because that's what you do, isn't it? You laugh along and you tell yourself it was nothing, a slip of the tongue, an unfortunate turn of phrase. But it happened again 2 weeks later at a neighbor's barbecue, and again at her cousin's anniversary party in June. Trent started showing up at more of our social occasions, always with some plausible reason. A mutual friend's invitation, a professional courtesy, once even claiming he'd been invited by Marlene's sister, which I later learned was a lie so smooth I hadn't even considered questioning it. He'd shake my hand a beat too firmly, hold eye contact a beat too long, the way a man does when he's confirmed something about you and wants you to know it without saying it out loud. He never insulted me directly. Men like Trent don't need to. They let the room do it for them, one carefully placed comment at a time, while they stand back looking gracious. The money things started slower, quieter, the way water finds cracks in a foundation long before you notice the wall is bowing. I found a bank statement in March that showed a transfer from our joint household account into something labeled Meridian Growth Fund. $12,000, gone in a single afternoon. When I asked Marlene about it, she waved it off. "It's just moving between accounts, Walter. Don't worry about the details. I've got it handled." I remember standing in our kitchen holding that statement, feeling something cold settle in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Then came the email. I wasn't snooping. I want to be honest about that because I've never been a man who goes digging through his wife's things. It landed in my inbox by accident, a forwarding error, the kind of small mechanical mistake that changes everything downstream of it. A message from Trent to Marlene. Subject line reading, "Timeline for transition," discussing something called a durable power of attorney and referencing an appraisal on a piece of commercial property. A piece of property that, as far as I knew, belonged entirely to me and had absolutely nothing to do with any conversation Marlene and I had ever had. I sat at my desk that night for a long time just looking at that email, feeling the floorboards under 34 years of marriage give the smallest, most silent creak I had ever felt. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Something in my gut, the same instinct that's kept me alive around industrial machinery for 40 years, the sense that tells you when something is about to go wrong before you can explain why, told me I needed to understand the whole picture before I said a single word. So I called my daughter. Paige came out to the shop 2 days later, sat across from me in my cramped little office with the smell of cutting oil still hanging in the air, and listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, tapping her pen against a legal pad the way she does when she's already 3 steps ahead and deciding how much to say out loud. "Dad," she finally said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." That sentence, I recognized it the moment it left her mouth, because it's the same sentence I've used my whole life whenever I had to deliver bad news to someone I loved. It's the sentence you use when you already know the truth is going to hurt, and all you can do is soften the landing as much as possible before you let it fall. She told me she'd started noticing things almost 8 months earlier. Not because she was suspicious of her mother exactly, but because forensic accounting's a strange profession that rewires the way you see numbers everywhere, even in your own family's finances. A conversation overheard at Thanksgiving about restructuring the estate,
An offhand comment from her mother about Trent handling the paperwork on something Paige had never heard mentioned before. Little threads that, on their own, meant nothing, but together had started forming a shape she didn't like. She'd spent months quietly pulling it apart. Public records searches on Callaway Meridian Partners, which turned out to be registered to a P.O. box and had exactly one other client Paige could locate, a woman in her 70s in Tyler who'd lost access to nearly $400,000 of her late husband's pension before her son intervened. Trent Callaway wasn't licensed with the SEC. He wasn't licensed with anything. He'd built an entire identity out of confidence and cardstock letterhead, the same way a magician builds an illusion out of misdirection and good lighting. Paige opened her laptop and showed me documents she'd obtained. Some through legitimate channels, some her mother had left sitting on the shared family cloud drive without realizing her daughter still had access from years earlier when she'd helped set up the account. A durable power of attorney form, drafted, dated 3 weeks earlier, requiring only my signature to grant Marlene full authority over Briggs Fabrications business accounts in the event of incapacitation. Language so broad, a good lawyer could drive a truck through it. An appraisal on the commercial lot behind my shop, land I'd bought outright in 2011, valued at nearly triple what I paid for it, thanks to a new highway interchange the county had quietly approved. And an email chain, Marlene and Trent spanning 4 months, discussing how to position the transition before what they called, chillingly, the retirement conversation with Walter. I sat there in my own office, in the chair I'd sat in for 26 years, and felt something in me go very still and very cold. "Is there audio?" I asked Paige, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I need to hear her say it, not read it. Hear it." She hesitated, then nodded, and pulled up a voice memo she'd recovered from a shared device. A conversation recorded, apparently accidentally, when Marlene's phone had been sitting on a kitchen counter during a call with Trent I'd been out at the shop for. Marlene's voice, warm and familiar, and utterly unlike the woman I thought I knew, saying, "Once the birthday party's behind us and everyone's seen how happy I am, it'll look natural when I start scaling back Walter's role." Nobody questions a wife taking care of a husband. And Trent, laughing softly, "Especially not a wife married to the caterer of the family." The caterer. That word landed in my chest like a dropped anvil. She'd used it before he ever said it publicly. It hadn't been a slip at that party. It had been rehearsed contempt, polished smooth over months, waiting for an audience. I looked at my daughter and asked her the only question that mattered. "What do we do?" She closed the laptop slowly, met my eyes and said, "We let them show everyone exactly who they are. In front of the whole room. At the party." Part of me wanted to march straight to Marlene that same afternoon and lay every document on the kitchen table between us. 34 years of marriage doesn't just evaporate the moment you learn something ugly. Some stubborn, hopeful piece of me still wanted an explanation that would make all of it make sense in some way that didn't end with betrayal. But Paige talked me out of moving too fast, and she was right to. "If we confront her privately," she said, "Trent disappears. The accounts get scrubbed, and in 6 months it happens again somewhere else, to someone else's father. This only stops if it stops in the open." So we built a plan the way I'd build anything else. Carefully, methodically, checking every joint before we trusted it to hold weight. Paige had a friend from her firm, a forensic auditor named Renata Cole, who specialized in exactly this kind of elder financial exploitation, a term I hated hearing applied to myself, 61 years old, and still able to run a 41-man shop floor, but a term that fit the pattern precisely once you set your pride aside and looked at the facts. Renata agreed to review everything Paige had gathered, and confirmed within 2 days that what we were looking at constituted, at minimum, attempted financial elder abuse and likely fraud. Trent's unlicensed operation alone was enough to draw the attention of the Texas State Securities Board, and the forged appraisal paperwork raised the stakes considerably further.
Paige also reached out, carefully and quietly, to a family friend, a man named Curtis Ambrose, a retired Montgomery County prosecutor who'd known Marlene and me for almost 20 years through church, back before he moved into private consulting work. Curtis had been invited to the birthday party independently months earlier, entirely unaware of any of this. When Paige called him and laid out what she'd found, there was a long silence on the line before he said quietly, "Paige, I need you to send me everything you have tonight. And I need you to know, if even half of this is accurate, I'm not just going to be a guest at that party."
We arranged for a simple audio-visual setup with the country club's events coordinator, framed as a surprise retrospective slideshow of Marlene's 60 years, a plausible, sentimental cover that raised no suspicion whatsoever. Paige's husband, Marcus, who works in IT, quietly tested the projector and sound system 2 days before the party, confirming the screen at the back of the ballroom could be triggered remotely from a laptop Paige would keep in her bag all evening.
I want to tell you honestly that I did not feel triumphant during any of this. I felt sick most nights, lying awake next to a woman I'd shared a bed with for 3 decades, wondering how many other small lies had been laid so carefully into the architecture of our life together that I'd simply walked past them without noticing. The way you walk past a hairline crack in a foundation 100 times before the day it finally gives way.
But underneath the sickness,
there was something else, too. Something steadier. Something that felt almost like the calm I get right before I fire up a piece of equipment I've repaired myself, and I already know, in my hands and my gut, that it's going to run true. Paige had that same calm in her eyes the morning of the party, when she came by the house early, ostensibly to help her mother with decorations, but really to do one final check of the equipment and slip Renata's summary report onto a flash drive tucked into her clutch. "Dad," she told me quietly in the driveway before I left to pick up the cake ingredients, "whatever happens in that room tonight, you did not do a single thing wrong, not for 1 day of your marriage. I need you to walk in there believing that all the way down." I nodded, though I wasn't sure yet that I believed it. I baked that cake with hands that trembled just slightly. Whether from the burns or from something else, I honestly couldn't say. And when I carried it into the Cypress Grove ballroom that evening in my one good tie, I had no idea I was walking directly into the moment Paige had promised me. The moment I'd become, against every instinct in my body, the most interesting man in that entire room. The cake made it to the dessert table after all. I set it down myself, my hands steadier than they'd been in the driveway 2 hours earlier, and watched Marlene blow out 60 candles surrounded by people clapping and phones raised to capture the moment. Trent stood just behind her right shoulder, the way a man stands when he's already begun rehearsing his place in a life that isn't his yet. I caught Paige's eye across the room. She gave me the smallest nod. "Before we cut the cake," I said, loud enough to carry, but not shouting, "I think everyone would enjoy a little retrospective we put together. Marcus, if you would." The lights dimmed. I watched Marlene's face in that half-second of darkness, still smiling, still gracious, still utterly certain of the ground beneath her. The screen at the back of the ballroom flickered to life. It didn't start with an accusation. It started with photographs. Marlene as a young nurse, our wedding day, Cole and Paige as children on the porch of the house I built with my own hands. A gentle murmur of appreciation moved through the crowd. Then the images stopped, and Renata Cole's summary report filled the screen instead, followed by the audio file Paige had recovered. Marlene's voice filled the ballroom, warm and unmistakable. "Once the birthday party's behind us and everyone's seen how happy I am, It'll look natural when I start scaling back Walter's role. A pause, then Trent's laugh, low and amused. Especially not a wife married to the caterer of the family. I have never in my life heard a room go silent the way that room went silent. Not the polite quiet of a toast being made, a different silence, heavier. The kind where every single person understands, in the exact same second, that they are watching something come apart in real time. Marlene's smile didn't fade so much as collapse all at once, like a structure whose load-bearing wall had finally given way. That's edited. That's taken out of context, she said, her voice cracking on the last word. Trent moved first, and moved fast, lunging toward the small table where Marcus had the laptop connected, one hand already reaching for the cord. In his hurry, he clipped the corner of the dessert table, his loafer catching the leg at just the wrong angle, and he went down hard. Not gracefully, not with any of the polish he'd spent a year performing, but sprawled flat across the floor in front of 40 guests, his phone skittering out of his jacket pocket and landing screen up at Curtis Ambrose's feet. Curtis bent down, unhurried, and picked it up. The screen was still lit, showing an open text thread with a name I didn't recognize. A woman in Tyler, it would turn out later, one of Trent's other targets. Mid-conversation about a POA he needed signed, before her son starts asking questions. Curtis straightened, faced the room, and introduced himself the way I imagine he'd done 1,000 times in a courtroom, calm, unhurried, absolutely certain. My name is Curtis Ambrose. I spent 22 years as a prosecutor in this county. What I've just seen and heard constitutes evidence of financial exploitation, unlicensed securities activity, and likely elder fraud. Mr. Calloway, I'd strongly advise you not to leave this building. The room broke open after that in stages, exactly the way Paige had warned me it might. First confusion, heads turning toward each other. Then recognition, as guests who'd known Marlene for years began putting the pieces together out loud, in hushed, horrified whispers. Then the anger. A woman near the bar, one of Marlene's oldest friends, standing up and saying, "Marlene, how could you?" in a voice that carried across the whole ballroom. Marlene turned toward me, mascara streaking, reaching for something to say that might undo the last 4 minutes. "Walter, please, let me explain." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You called me the handyman before he ever said it out loud tonight," I said. "You rehearsed it. I heard the recording, Marlene." She had no answer for that. There wasn't one to give. Police arrived at the Cypress Grove Country Club within 20 minutes of Curtis Ambrose's phone call, and Trent Calloway was taken out through the same doors he'd walked through so many times, with that easy, rehearsed confidence, except this time in handcuffs, his loafers still scuffed from the fall. The Texas State Securities Board opened a formal investigation within the week. It turned out Curtis's instincts had been right about the scope of it. Trent had run the same playbook on at least 3 other families across 2 counties, always finding a spouse or aging parent who felt slightly invisible somewhere in their own life, always offering just enough attention to make the deception feel like being seen for the first time in years. One of his other victims, the widow in Tyler, testified alongside Paige's documentation at the eventual trial. He was convicted on multiple counts of securities fraud and elder financial exploitation and sentenced to 9 years. Marlene was never charged criminally. The durable power of attorney had never been signed, the transfer of the commercial property never completed, and the prosecutor's office ultimately determined her role, while morally indefensible, hadn't crossed the specific legal lines Trent's had. But the marriage was over before the ambulance lights had even finished flashing in the parking lot that night. I moved out within the week into a small apartment above the shop I built with my own hands 30 years earlier, and found there was a strange, quiet peace in falling asleep to the low hum of machinery I understood completely. surrounded by nothing that could lie to me. Marlene reached out twice in the months that followed, asking to talk, asking for a chance to explain herself in a way the recording hadn't allowed for. I listened both times. I even believed, by the second conversation, that some part of what she said was true, that she'd felt overlooked in her retirement, that Trent had offered her a version of attention I hadn't thought to offer in years, that loneliness can make a person justify almost anything to themselves before they even realize they're doing it. Understanding something, though, isn't the same as forgiving it. And I told her as much, gently, the way you tell someone something true that you know will still hurt to hear. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I kept the business, the shop, the land behind it that had nearly become someone else's asset entirely. Marlene kept the house, and I like to believe whatever lessons she's still working through in the quiet of it. Cole flew in from Dallas the week after the party and sat with me on my new little balcony above the shop, drinking coffee out of mismatched mugs, saying almost nothing for a long while, before finally telling me he was proud of how I'd handled it. No shouting, no public wreckage beyond what the truth itself had already caused. And Paige, my sharp, steady, forensic accountant daughter, who saw the whole thing coming months before I could bring myself to, came by that same week and hugged me longer than she has since she was small enough to fit against my chest. "You didn't deserve one single second of that humiliation, Dad," she told me. "Not 1 second of it was about you. It was always about what you represented. Steady, honest, easy to underestimate. That's exactly why they thought they could get away with it." I think about that a lot now. About how the people who work hardest to make you feel small are so often the ones most afraid of what would happen if the room finally saw you clearly. I spent one humiliating minute standing in a ballroom holding a cake I'd baked with my own 2 hands, feeling like the smallest version of myself I'd been in decades. And it turned out that minute was simply the last dark moment before the truth was finally allowed to breathe. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from. If there's a room in your own life where you've quietly let yourself be made smaller than you actually are, I hope you find your version of that screen lighting up at the back of the room. And if you've ever stood exactly where I stood, holding something you made with your own hands while someone laughed at you for it, I hope you know that cake was never the thing that needed defending. You were. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it. And stay a while longer. There's always another story waiting.